On today's Locked On Texans podcast, PFF's own Sam Munson joins the show to talk Stefon Diggs and how should the Houston Texans attack the draft.
You are Locked On Texans, your daily Houston Texans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Texans fans across the nation, across the great state of Texas, and especially here in the city of Houston, welcome to this Monday episode of the Locked On Texans podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If this is your first show, ever watching, ever listening, thank you for stopping by. Please do us a favor, subscribe, like, and comment on YouTube. At Locked On Texans and on Twitter at Locked On Texans as well. Thank you to all of our returning listeners coming back to continue watching and listening to the show as Cody and I continue to talk Texans football. On the other side of the screen, Sports Illustrated's own Texans credentialed media member, Cody Davis. I'm your Texans football analyst, John Some Sports Guy Hickman. As I mentioned in the cold open, we will be joined by Sam Munson from PFF. He's going to talk about his thoughts on how should Houston attack the draft, and the little bit of talk with Munson about the Stefon Diggs trade. So that's going to be fun. But we open up today's show looking at Stefon Diggs getting acclimated to Houston. The contract change is going on for Houston. It helps out both sides, I believe, getting his number, paying some money. So Cody, in a couple of days, he bought number 1 from Jimmy Ward. He got some money moved up. Right, so he lost 100,000, but he picked up 3.5. Let's talk about Stefon getting acclimated with the Texans.
Yeah, so after the Buffalo Bills traded Stefon Diggs to the Houston Texans on Wednesday, there's been a lot of changes ever since then. As everybody know, on Thursday afternoon, the Texans did void the last 3 years of Stefon Diggs' contract, which means that he could potentially be a 1-year rental for this organization. He will be making $22.5 million for this upcoming season, which, by the way, John, even with the increased salary for this upcoming season, they still come out a lot cheaper getting Stefon Diggs versus if they had signed Mike Evans. So they still had an opportunity to save some money. But, John, this just goes back to something that you always talked about. Every time we look at Nick Caserio, especially going into this offseason, with so much money in the salary cap space, it was always how in the world is Nick Caserio going to spread the wealth. He did it, but he did it in his own turn. What's your favorite saying that he's always said? You have to find the value for the player, match the value for the player, and that's exactly what he did because, look, even though when he first got traded to the city of Houston, this was a man that was still under contract up until, I want to say, the 2027 season with those 3 remaining years left. But I think the 2027 season would have had him making somewhere in the ballpark to like $25 to $26 million. However, we all know when you get to that 2027 years, you also talking about, CJ, Tank, and Will, and all the rest of your young foundational guys. They're going to be the guys on the books making the big buck. But I like the fact that Nick Caserio, Coach DeMeco Ryans, and Stefon Diggs had an opportunity to rework his contract because, look, I believe that he's definitely going to last more than 1 season in the city of Houston. However, he is 30 years old. He's getting up there in age, and they also put themselves in a position where they are not going to be committed long-term to him whenever his age is starting to show.
I've been wrestling with the decision to, void the last 3 years of this deal, push up to 3.5. I've been wrestling with how I feel about this because on one hand, I look at this and I say to myself, well, what if this is an AJ Bouye situation where that year he comes in, he balls out, you look to re-sign him, and he goes elsewhere. And right now, I think for Houston, opposite sides of the ball, I think AJ Bouye at that point in his career was a very good cornerback, and I think he should have stayed in Houston. The Houston Texans should have did everything that they could to retain him, but with Diggs, it's like, what if he goes out there and has that Diggs type of year, and now you're at the risk of losing him in the middle or at the beginning of your championship window? And I've been wrestling with that because Yeah, I believe that it makes 100% sense to re-sign Diggs after the year, but I also say the same thing about Nico Collins, who like
Yeah,
is
that
this
is
going to
true.
be his year where he comes back to back performances, back to back 1,000-yard receiving seasons, and we've seen Nick give contract extensions uh in December, right towards the
Mm-hmm.
midway part of the season,
Mm-hmm.
early in the season, right? Maybe even see something in training camp. So between now and I would say training camp, how much steam picks up on whether or not you bring back Nico, because next year, and shout out to Texans Cap on Twitter, he was asked, could the Texans sign both players? Next year will be the year where if Nico is a back-to-back 1,000-yard receiving season, have another back-to-back 1,000-yard receiving season, excuse me, and Stefon Diggs comes in, he proves to be a wide receiver one. Well, you got two guys on your roster at the same position that if Houston looks to, re-sign both of them, we'll be making 22 to 23 million plus dollars next year as receivers. So is that something that Nick Casario wants to carry on his roster? I've been wrestling with it. I have no real thought. I have no real clue on how this works out in Houston favor, outside of it gives them the opportunity to see which one of the two should we consider not bringing back, but it also gives them the opportunity to see should we bring both of these receivers back, and we still have Tank Dell, and we hope that John Mechie blossoms. So now we look at a full receiving core locked in to at least the year before we gotta sign CJ to the
Mm-hmm.
extension. I'm not sure. So that's what I'm kind of worried about. I'm not 100% sure which way the Houston goes. And I do think this is a tricky situation that they gamble. It's a big gamble, but if it pays off in the end, you kind of got to wonder what type of season did they have if next year we're having
Mm-hmm.
the conversation of, man, it paid out in Nick's favor the way that he did the Diggs deal. I'm interested to see. I have no real thought around the decision to move up the money, avoid the years. It's a big game.
Um, really quick, I do wonder, and this just popped in my head when you started talking. I do wonder going into the season how much will the influence and a relationship of both CJ and D'Amico Ryans will have on Stefon Diggs. Because remember, when we were sitting up here a couple days ago, reacting to the trade, of course, the only negative that people can say about Stefon Diggs right now is the fact that he's this quote unquote diva. But I always looked at his diva personality as someone who just wants to win. And he realized the other two situations that he was in, he just couldn't win with those teams, especially everything that was going on, both on and off the field in Buffalo. If he comes here to the city of Houston, first and foremost, he's going to be getting up there in age. But two, and most importantly, you're looking at a situation where CJ Stroud and Coach D'Amico Ryans could be the best coach and quarterback pairing that he has ever played with. And I know that's a lot to say as of right now because I understand we've only seen 1 year out of both of those guys. But when we look at the influence that both of those guys had in 1 year inside their locker room, there is no one in the world that is not going to continue to transpire in year 2024, 25, 26, and so on.
CJ isn't due for his major contract until what is this 2027. They can pick up the 50th option if
Mm-hmm.
they choose to do so. Then 2028 will be where you see his major contract. I don't think it's smart to, if CJ continues on where he is right now, I don't think it's smart to pick up a 50th option because now you're really gambling. But let's just say again, void the years of Stefon. Let's say we see a deal for, and I'm just thinking ahead, a situation where we see either Nico or Stefon get a 2-year deal where you kind of max them out in that 2-year time frame to help your roster, and that will put Houston. That will put this at 2026. No money for CJ will be needed yet. Around that time, you'll have to look to pay Derek Stingley, but the big
Mm-hmm.
one still won't impact that salary cap. And that 2 year window, you're looking at a 2 year championship window, which I think is fair. So whether it's Nico or Stefon, maybe that's a route Houston is looking to go towards in order to really again maximize the value of the players that they have on a roster in this championship window. This show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is now authorized to sell Major League Baseball tickets, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app really go down closer you get to the first pitch with killer last minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. They have opportunity for you on the last minute deals where you can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, theater, comedy events near you. Flash deals where you save even more with exclusive in app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On NFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply again. Create an account, redeem code LOCKEDON Locked On for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back in, Locked On Texans listeners and viewers. Thank you for continuing supporting and watching and viewing the Locked On Texans podcast. We have a guest today, straight from PFF, Sam Munson. Super glad that you're here. I can't wait to talk Texans football. Thank you for stopping by. I want to dive right into it with a hypothetical question. First, are you a fan of buying jersey numbers?
I guess it depends on the jersey number. I like the guys that have, worn a certain number for their entire career, all the way through college, high school, the NFL. They get to a new team and someone else is wearing that jersey. I'm cool with that. The ones that are just like, I want to wear this number because it's cool and here's some money to do it. That, you could live without the number. I don't need that.
If you were charging to sell your number away, how much would you charge, hypothetically speaking?
Yeah,
What's the cap where it's kind of like, Stefon just, got the number one from Jimmy Ward here in Houston for $100K. Is that too much, or do you think that's reasonable?
I feel like that's overkill. I tell you, like Jimmy Ward, the first thing I would do if I went to a team is I would claim number one, because somebody's going to come along looking for number one in a year or two's time, and they're going to offer you, hundreds of thousands of dollars for it. So you go claim one of those cool numbers the first time you rock up, and someone else might buy it off you later.
Yeah, it's an investment, man. So I do want to ask you, what has been your overall view and grade for the Houston Texans this offseason to this point? Also, and do you believe with the moves that they've made, have they entered into a championship window, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think they've had a really nice offseason. They've done a lot of good things. Brought in a lot of good players, and certainly they seem to be behaving as if they feel they can contend right away. Like the moves for, Danielle Hunter, even if you just sort of contrast him, the Vikings and the Texans, the Vikings they basically swapped edge rushers, right? The Vikings brought in Jonathan Grenard. The Texans end up bringing in Danielle Hunter. So the Vikings got cheaper and younger, whereas the Texans got older and more expensive. Okay, he's not, it's not like he's over the hill or anything, but it's unusual to see a team sort of voluntarily getting older and more expensive at a certain position when you've got two, good quality players. And the only reason you do that is if you think that guy can push you over the edge or sort of materially change the overall outcome of the season, like you think you can contend. And then the Stefon Diggs trade is a similar story. They got great value out of it, but you saw the way they treated his contract afterwards, sort of nixing those final few years and effectively making it a one-year rental. I mean, that's a short-term deal. That's a deal because they think Diggs can help them go somewhere special this year. So yeah, it's difficult to argue with them based off what we saw from CJ Stroud and Nico Collins and Tank Dell and Bobby Slowick, the offensive coordinator, and head coach D'Amico Ryans. I mean, they made way more noise last year than they were expected to. So with the additions of guys like Hunter and Diggs, it might be a team that can contend in the AFC.
I want to stay on a Diggs topic. Are you a little bit skeptical about the Diggs trade now that the contract situation details are out? Does this potentially kind of makes the 1 year rental? Does that make Houston, look irresponsible? That trade, does that look irresponsible for Houston, or are you looking at this as an all-in, throw all of your chips in type of deal?
I don't think it's either really. It certainly changes everything when you see, that it's a 1 year rental deal. He's not eligible for a compensatory pick if he leaves after this year either. So it's not even one of those deals you see sometimes where you can bring a guy over, you play him for a year, you let him walk, and you get something back, with the comp picks formula. They're not even playing that game. They're literally sort of saying that what they gave up for Diggs is worth 1 year of Stefon Diggs and the current version of Stefon Diggs. And it might be, if you get one elite year of play out of Diggs, him playing with a chip on his shoulder, trying to get the best version of his game so that he can get one more payday, along with Nico Collins and Tank Dell and CJ Stroud and Bobby Slowick and the scheme, that might be worth it. That might be worth, it's a future second round pick. And then they got a couple of picks back. It's sort of shaking out to like a third round pick value, right? I mean, there are worse third round picks that have been spent in NFL history than, getting one incredible year out of a good receiver that's already coming onto a good offense. So, I think it changes the dynamic where you look at the trade and you don't think the Texans stole him anymore, which it looked like right at the start. It's like, that's absolute robbery from their point of view. Now it's like, okay, they didn't steal him, but I don't think they're being reckless or crazy with their picks either. I mean, a third round pick for even one season of extremely high level receiver play is a very valuable thing in today's NFL.
And I think for Houston, the way I look at it, I've had some time to kind of sit and think, right? I think for Houston, they saw the potential of this offense led by CJ Stroud last year. In their very last game against the Baltimore Ravens, there was no receiver that was able to get open and be an impact player for that offense. Nico Collins led the way with 80 yards, but Robert Woods had, I think, negative 2 yards in that game, receiving yards. Like nobody else was able to do it. And we know how dynamic Diggs can be, can run every route. I think now in his career, you're looking at a player that the deep threat ability isn't there as consistently as you may want it to be, but you do have Tank Dell who can hit a lot of those deep home runs. But anything in between 5 to 15 yards, he's a dangerous receiver. And he can get those yak yards. When I look at the 1 year rental, I think for Houston, this is a great gamble, right? I think they're throwing all their chips in, and it gives them an opportunity for another year of evaluating Nico Collins. They'll have the money to pay both next year. Do I think that they'll pay both? I'm not 100% certain, but I think that they're going to take their time this season and evaluate both players. We may end up seeing an extension for Nico after the draft or before training camp. But if that happens, then I look at them looking at Stefon Diggs and thinking to themselves, well, maybe this is an opportunity for us to evaluate a 31-year-old receiver who is coming off a good year, but has had some on-field issues that we may not want to deal with if the production isn't there. Listen, guys, this show is brought to you and sponsored by BetterHelp. A lot of us spend our time in our lives wishing we had more time. I know that's kind of ironic. But the question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? Would you squeeze in more Locked On podcasts into your day? Would you go for a jog? Will you pick up a basketball? Will you pick up a book? Would you spend more time with your loved ones? How would you use it? The best way to squeeze in that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suitable to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/locked-on today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/locked-on. I do want to transition over to the NFL draft, which is upon us. It is that season. It's time to discuss the Houston Texans and who they'll select with the 42 pick after trading away their 23rd overall pick. So my question to you is, with how they've addressed the offseason, Danielle Hunter, Stefon Diggs, do you think there's a player with the 42nd overall pick that will be there for Houston that they should select? And if so,
Yeah,
who should it be?
when when you don't pick until the middle of the second round, you're kind of at the mercy of how the draft pans out, and you're sort of sitting back and just watching how that first round goes and seeing who starts to slide towards you. I think generally when you look at Houston's roster, when you look at their offseason, obviously like a third receiver would have been really interesting before the Stefon Diggs trade. Now that's probably not going to happen, at least not that high. I think the defensive line is in a pretty good position. Maybe if one of those interior defensive tackles starts to fall, maybe they could grab that guy. But I think they would like to spend that pick on offensive line. I think if all things were equal, if they had their chance to project the draft right now and said, what's the optimum way this draft can fall? Who would you want at that spot? I think they would like a couple of offensive linemen available at that spot. And I think they could go kind of any spot along that offensive line. It's a solid group. I think generally the scheme, Bobby Slowick's sort of Shanahan version of that scheme, I think generally that it helps offensive linemen. We see it as a quarterback friendly scheme and a receiver friendly scheme and a running back friendly scheme, but it helps offensive linemen as well. When you look at that offense throughout the NFL, wherever it goes, you get career years out of offensive tackles. You get these offensive linemen having great seasons as well. And it makes guys that don't look spectacular on paper look like they're much better players as well. So that group looks a little bit better than it might be, maybe, but I think they would like to spend that second round pick on offensive linemen. I think the interior group is good value in the second round. I think when you're in the second round in terms of tackles, you're already down to those developmental guys, and that's a little bit scary. But I think you could probably grab a guard or maybe a center if you want to shuffle the offensive line at that spot.
I do want to push back on that just a little bit because I think for Houston, that may be one of their deepest positions if everybody is healthy. Kenyon Green, former first rounder pick, he's coming back this year. And Houston got great production when they were on the field in Jared Patterson and Juice Scruggs, who was interchangeable at left guard and center. I think for Houston's offensive line, it's important for them to stay on the field and be healthy. And I kind of was shocked, man. I thought that we may see them address, from your point of view, the cornerback position or the linebacker position. Right now, Houston only has 4 linebackers, and 2 of those guys are, essentially special teamers. There's been a lot of talk with Edgerrin Cooper out of A&M. Do you like his game? Do you think he fit with D'Amico Ryans alongside of Christian Harris and Azeez Al-Shaair?
Yeah, linebacker's tough. I think that it's definitely a spot where you could grab a linebacker there as well. Linebacker has become such a difficult position to project into the NFL these days. When you look, even if you look at those, you see the graphics get put out these days where it's like, here's the first linebacker that's been taken for the last 10 years, right? And most positions, first receiver, first running back, first whatever, the list is pretty good, right? Like the NFL generally has a reasonable idea of how to rank these guys. And even if you don't pick the exact best guy, the list is good. If you're picking the top 10 guys every year, it's going to look like a pretty good list. If you look at the first linebacker taken in the last 10 years, it's not even a good list of players. Like the league is just throwing darts at linebackers in the draft these days. It's really tough because every offensive schematic wrinkle in the last 10 years has been designed around putting linebackers in conflict and putting those guys in a bind and making it difficult for them to play. So there aren't that many good linebackers anymore because the job is so difficult, and projecting them from the college landscape to the NFL seems to have become more difficult than it's ever been. So yeah, I think it's definitely a spot that they could address there, but I think it's become a very risky position to draft. And I think that's why it's getting, people talk about linebacker getting devalued the way safety or running back is getting devalued. I don't think it's necessarily true, but I think it's being pushed down the draft because teams are becoming aware of how hard it is to draft these guys and how bad they are effectively at getting it right.
I also think the amount of nickel defenses that are being played now, nickel defense is kind of like the base defense now in the NFL. I read
Right.
where you mentioned this year's running back class is better than what a lot of people are giving them credit for. Who are some of your running back sleepers in this draft that make you say that? And with those sleepers in this draft, because I like Bucky Irvin and I think he'll be a third rounder. Blake Corum, I think injury wise, you look at him and you kind of wonder how long does he have in the NFL, and running back lifespans are already short in the league. But are there any sleepers that you could say, man, you know what? With Houston signing Joe Mixon and Damian Pierce having a down year last year, this guy would fit this roster with Bobby Sloyd, with CJ, with the additions, with Tank, with Nico, and sitting behind Joe Mixon. Is there a guy that you like?
I think there's quite a few. Yeah, you're right. I think this running back class is a lot better than people are give them credit for. It's not great in terms of breakaway explosive speed. There aren't that many guys with truly elite top end speed, but I think there's a lot of really good running backs. Blake Corum, I think if he hadn't had the injury, he would be seen as a top draft pick. And we're viewing the 80% of Blake Corum as who he's going to be going forward. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think he can bounce back and become the 2022 version of Blake Corum, who was a genuinely special player. Couple players, though, that I really like that would make sense. Tyrone Tracy Jr. from Purdue. This was a guy that was a receiver and then transitioned to running back. So he's old for a prospect, but he's got very little experience playing running back. Like he's a strange prospect in those terms. Incredible broken tackle rate, is still extremely raw as a running back. Doesn't sort of really have the feel for what he's doing, but is so hard to get to the ground. Like he's just a natural ball carrier and runner with the ball. Is really difficult to tackle, is really difficult to get down. Notre Dame's Audric Estime, I think, is a really good back. I think he's going to be a better NFL player than he was a college running back. Big, explosive, fixed his 40 time in his pro day, so I think he's faster than he looks. He's for a big back, he can really move when he's gets a crease. So I definitely like him as well. And then Will Shipley from Clemson is a player that I think is a really natural runner. Like he just has
a lot
a
of
feel.
mock drafts where Houston and Shipley go together.
He just has a feel for how to play the position. Like he's always finding the right crease, maximizing what's there, rolling off contact, like just making the right cut, the right move at the right time. And he turns out he was a way better athlete than people thought he was as well. When he tested his pro day, around I think a 4.38, something like that, was explosive, like a good vertical. Former top recruit as well. So I think he sort of looked at, because of the way his college career ended at Clemson, people aren't that high on him, but I think when you watch his tape, it's very good.
My last question before we get out of here, man, I just really wanted to ask you, with how this team is currently put together, who's a player that you believe is so special that drafting this guy would take Houston over the hump? I do want to remind you, 42, 59, 86. That's where Houston is drafting in the first 100. Is there a guy that, with this foundation that they have, you can say, man, if Houston can get his hands on him, that'll do something for him?
Yeah, it's tough when you're drafting that low down because you're probably not at that stage, you're trying to hit the lottery if you're expecting a rookie to come in and be fantastic. Obviously, it happens every year, right? Puka Nacua is one of the biggest impact players in the NFL last year, and he was drafted in the 5th round. So it can happen. I think the absolute jackpot for Houston at that point is if one of the developmental tackles was around in that 2nd round, and they grabbed, if a Tyler Guyton fell that far, or a Jordan Morgan or somebody like that fell to the middle of the 2nd, Houston grabbed the developmental guy with all the tools and all the kind of the physical ability, And then immediately it just clicked, and that guy was able to play right away. And he didn't need, 2 years of development. They were just able to coach him and get him to his high end ceiling. Now you found like a top tier starting tackle that you can pair with Laramie Tunsil. And I think that would make a big difference to that offensive line.
Are you not as high on Titus Howard as we may be in Houston?
Yeah, I think Titus Howard, I think Kenyon Green, I know he was a first rounder, but we haven't seen enough yet for you to be kind of confident in him going forward. So I think those guys, I think you want competition for them. Maybe Titus Howard bounces back in and you get the best version of him going forward. But, until you're confident in what those guys are, I think you have to keep swinging at offensive linemen, even if it's only building depth at that point. I think it's a good thing. So they're definitely, the offensive line isn't bad, right? But I think it's definitely an area that could be improved. And it would make a difference to this team, given how important the rest of that offense is.
Here it is. Sam Munson of PFF. Thank you for stopping by the Locked On Texans podcast. Before you go, please tell our listeners where they can find you on all of your social media platforms.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me. PFF_Sam is where I am on Twitter/X or whatever we call that these days. And then obviously the PFF NFL podcast, where you can hear me and Steve every week.
Thank you for stopping by. We really appreciate it. Until next time, Locked On Texans, you're a family member now. You got that stamp.